Hello. Hello, friends. Friends from different spaces and times. I hope this finds you well. I I guess there's a few remarks that I'd like to say regarding sort of preparatory remarks and the trajectory of what is intended here. So we find ourselves, or at least I find myself, in the middle of the coronavirus, and I figured why not do something contemplative, and so take up reading each and every one of the propositions of Spinoza's ethics and reading them with a kind of rigor and finesse and fidelity. I'm sorry, I think the sun is coming through with the light, um, and sort of going through in each and every one and sort of going slowly through all of the propositions and dealing with them in their appropriate order. Um, it's quite a large task, so I'm sure it's going to take quite a bit of time. In terms of motivation, I think it's also appropriate to speak of Spinoza's letter to a friend. I think it's like letter 37, when he says that each and every one of us has to, for themselves, choose an end for their life and stick to that end. And so I think this is appropriate, especially given, as I said, given the situation. I think maybe some biographical remarks are appropriate in this respect. So, regarding Spinoza and the text, to give some sort of context and sort of a kind of, just a historical context for the work in question, Spinoza's life, what he was about. Because I think, if one just starts sort of just on the first reading of Spinoza's ethics, one is confronted with what is described by the French philosopher André Bergson or Henry Bergson, 20th century French philosopher. He said that it's just a juggernaut. It's a dreadnought. It's a dreadnought of propositions and axioms and lemmas, etc., that seem, just totally metaphysical. Like, why is this book called an ethics? It just seems like a contradiction in terms. You have this completely sort of a juggernaut of a text, and then you have this title of ethics. How is it an ethics? How is it about anything about practicality? I think, in fact, it does. I think the structure of the text and understanding how it's organized will lead to a deeper appreciation for what the text is about. And I think the text, if I could summarize what it's about the highest good. It's about what we should pursue in life and what is rational in that pursuit. What is rationally motivated. I think, so some biographical remarks about Spinoza. He was born in 1632 to a sort of expat family from Portugal. He was born in Amsterdam in the Dutch Republic, but his family's from Portugal originally. Some other eventful things of his life was that he was excommunicated in 1656 from the Jewish community in the Dutch Republic at the times, which gives you a picture of his kind of more polemical or controversial views, according to, for example, the motto he's most famous for, which is that, Deus seu natura, or God or nature, or God, by which I mean nature, so that God is nothing and above the multiplicity and unity of all that is to say, nature, and that nature is nothing other than the divine. And Spinoza is totally willing to speak about the divine body and the divine mind, and these are not contradictory things, right, for Spinoza, right? Whereas others would assume the divine body, what is that? That's absurd. So, but contra some other readings that think of Spinoza as an atheist or a pantheist, I think the most appropriate category is as he's a panentheist. That is to say that God is the whole as such, and everything in that whole is a part or partakes of divinity. so that he is also a religious thinker. But I don't think religion and reason are in conflict for Spinoza. They are quite the same thing. So that he has a very sort of unique conception of religiosity um, that seems unparalleled to how we usually think about religiosity. Yeah, so going back to his sort of uh, his more eventful lives, I mean, he died quite young. So he was 44 when he died, which is 1677. He didn't publish much. Uh, the the first thing he published, it was treated as blasphemy, atheism, materialism, the worst thing that one could possibly write. In 16, I believe, 74, the Tractatus Theological Philosophicus. I think it's clear there that it's a very political work. It's a very polemical work. And I think it's also very relevant to even today about the threat of despotism, the threat of mob mentality, of falling prey to hopes and fears of others, and not thinking for oneself, and not being able to reason appropriately about one's life and one's conduct, and to yeah, to take a certain courageousness to speak. Um, so, I mean, these are all nascent in the Tractatus Theological Philosophicus, especially at the time, and it was extremely controversial because he was very blasphemous against anything like organized religion and superstition. I think he thought, generally speaking, humanity is more susceptible to superstition and to what he calls imaginative thinking, and not thinking reasonably about how to organize society, how to be, how to espouse like values about freedom and free thought and free thinking, and sort of the 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 sharing of ideas, if I could put it that way, without being fearful of excommunication or death, essentially, like Galileo and the Catholic Church. So I think those are all in the forefront of his mind in writing the Tractatus Theological Philosophicus, though it's directed solely at the current state of affairs and the possible collapse of the Dutch Republic to basically what was like an oligarchy, and he wanted to avoid that. He wanted a democracy, essentially, a radical kind of democracy. Anyways, those things are in the text of the ethics. Um, those sort of commitments are in the ethics. And I think those sort of biographical remarks situate Spinoza from a metaphysician, an ontologist on first reading, to much more of a political and ethical thinker about thinking about what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to live a good life with others, specifically? And I think a clearer sort of argumentative case, or why this is the case, biographically, is if one reads a small treatise that was unpublished. So, I mean, Spinoza wrote the large majority of the ethics probably around 1660s and the early 1770s, but felt an exigency and demand to write something political, and so the Tractatus Theological Philosophicus was born. But probably already had a lot of the ethics sort of and the sort of systematicity of that text already written in form when he wrote the political works. But there was an earlier text before even that called the Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect, which is a much easier piece, and I really highly recommend it to anyone that's a new reader of Spinoza, because it's very clear. Because in that case, he has an audience in mind, quite like Descartes' Meditations. He speaks clearly in that case to an audience, to someone, and tries to empathize with the right reader rather than Spinoza's ethics, which is, as I said, a kind of juggernaut. But I think, in fact, Spinoza's ethics, I think once you understand who is it being read for and what is it demanding of the reader, it's more of like an invitation for philosophical friends spread out through space and time to be read by just anyone willing to reason and think clearly about what is said. But at least in the Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect, he's specifically addressing the reader and sort of guiding the reader by the hand, as it were, and sort of reasoning things out in a much more clear and less formidable way as in the case of the ethics. And in there, the text begins with a kind of stoic enterprise. You know, like what does it mean to find the highest good in life? Like where is the highest good? Like where do I find where can I invest my life? You know, how can I put myself and stock into things that actually matter through time, eternally, essentially. And well, there isn't any, right? Like honor doesn't do that. You know, the esteem of others, definitely not that. You know, pleasure is so temporary. It goes away. It comes and goes. How could I put my life into that? Um, like glory, as I said. I'm trying to think. Oh, wealth, especially. Like wealth can burn at any moment. There's nothing. Wealth is essentially just a codification of the esteem of others, which is completely and utterly, I don't want to say arbitrary, but is so willy nilly. Like, how could I possibly get a hold of myself? So, in that text, it's clearly articulated that he's searching for the highest good and thinking about the highest good. And as he says in a kind of almost mystical way, but I don't think it is, he wants to commune with nature. But here's the special thing with others. He wants to commune with nature with others. He wants to sort of be in a kind of maximal state of nature, so to speak, with others. That is a specifically political claim. And uh, it's not a strictly metaphysical one. Of course, as one reads the ethics, one will get that metaphysics, epistemology, a philosophy of mind, all these things are necessary to think about ourselves, our constitution, how we act, how we are impassioned, and how we act with adequate causation to think about our lives in a more adequate and ethically fulfilling way. So these things are all linked. And so, in that respect, I think that the structure of the text, the juggernaut of the text of the ethics, is in fact quite wrapped up in what Spinoza thinks of the good life and what is the good life and how to sort of lead the good life. And so I think Spinoza's ethics actually demands a kind of meditative and almost revisiting of the text. Hence why I'm coming back to the text now and to sort of re articulate and give a reason, a sense to each and every one of the propositions again. And I think the same can be said about any reader for Spinoza. So this is all to say, right? Especially the treatise on emanation and intellect, it, I think, re-situates ourselves into the text to prepare ourselves for this text, which is going to be about the highest good, about what does it mean to live a good life. And I think that end in view will put sort of a context and sort of give us orientation in the complexity and in the kind of the initial kind of prima facie juggernaut, like kind of complexity and network of propositions. Because, you know, as, wait, let me see, where did oh, here's the book, sorry. Yeah, as we'll see in the beginning, the book is separated in 5 parts, and the first part is De Deo, or of God, and that is straight up metaphysics, straight up ontology. And so one is like, how is this about ethics? How is this about anything about practicality? And I think there is something specifically about that already kind of nascent. I think if I can defend it, one has to ask, how do we know what is a good life if we don't even know what is, about what actually is the case, about how to think about nature, right? If I could put it this way, if we don't even know what nature is and get clear about the nature of nature, if I could put it that way, then how can we think about the nature of ethical action or the nature of a good life? How can we think about these things in their essentiality, about their most core components? If we can't even think about nature just in general, how could we get clear about ethical life? Right? This is essential. We need an ontology. We need an epistemology. These are all demanded to think through the complexity of life, including ourselves in life in general, which is, of course, not just anthropocentric, not just anthropomorphic. So, which is why Spinoza is the most, in a certain way, I don't want to say an anti humanist thinker, but thinking transhumanly, right? this text is not just made for humans, but just or for humanity, but for any rational thinker, any rational being whatsoever. Which is why he's a rationalist. So I guess that gives it for the preparatory remarks and the biographical information. I think we should read the first definition and begin there. So let's see if we can, what we got. Sorry, I was not prepared. All right, so first part, first definition. So, well, actually, I'll read the first definition first. So, by cause of itself, I understand that whose essence involves existence, or, that is to say, that whose nature cannot be conceived except as existing. The thing I wanted to say before I said the definition, which I'll say it again essentially as we go along, is what is a definition? We should think about that seriously. What is a definition? What does a definition do? How does it single out something? There's a classical conception of a definition from Aristotle, which is kind of a motto, which is proximate genus, specific difference. So in the case of the exemplary definition, which is that human beings, your humanity, are rational animals. You have animalia as the proximate genus, and you have the specific difference, which is what distinguishes humans from all other animals, which is to say rationality. Bring those two together, and you have a definition of humanity. You can have other kind of definitions that are indexical, that point to something and say, this is blah, 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 blah. You can have hypothetical definitions like, by a centaur, I mean something like this. And you can have a host of other kind of definitions, but at least minimally when we speak in our average way of definitions and about definitions, we think of something that is requiring, to be defined, right? And nothing other than just a kind of description, nothing really big, nothing too weighty. In this case, one might strike it as, what is this definition for? Cause of itself. Right? By cause of itself, I understand that whose essence involves existence. Is that a definition for you, Spinoza? Is that a definition for me? Like who is this valid for? Right? Beyond just the actual things in the definition, contained in the definition. Is this a hypothetical definition? Is this a dogmatic one? One might think of Spinoza as just a dogmatist, as just like, this is just a rationalist dogmatist, ontologist that just makes claims and doesn't really defend them. So he's just defining this thing called causa sui and not really defending it. I don't know if that's the case. That doesn't seem like a plausible interpretation, and not a charitable one either. So let's think about it, right? A cause of itself. Essence, existence, nature. What are these things? What is it? What is this definition doing? Okay, here's another model of a definition beyond the Aristotelian one that would be maybe helpful for us. It's a Hobbesian one. He gives an exemplary definition of a circle. Now, one might initially think a circle is just, well, I have a center point and then the endpoints of the circumference, and those are all defined in every case by the same radii. Now, that describes one property, one predicate of the circle. But there's another definition that Hobbes gives, which is a constructive one, which is to say you take that point and you circle it around, so to speak. You draw it all the way around, and you get a circle. And that circle, because you constructed it, you can also, from that construction, derive the predicate of the radii are equal. Of course it's equal. That's how we defined it and constructed it. So think of like a thought experiment of a architect with a master plan. The master plan has all the appropriate and essential components. Once constructed, you have all the necessary predicates that make that building what it is. So the construction, according to this plan, sort of lays out all that's necessary. We can envision it in the case of, like, let's say, future human beings that are able to construct human beings or animals or other kind of organic beings. there would be a master plan, maybe a genetic code that would sort of lay out all the things necessary for what it is to be a thing. And in this case, we have a definition which is the kind of constructive equivalence in the case of thought as it would be in the case of materiality. For those of you who have read the ethics before, you would know that there's a kind of what's called a parallelism between thought and materiality, or thought and body. I won't say more other than that. But I mean, I think it's important, at least for now, to think of, to go back to the definition, right? So if this definition is trying to show something, sort of build something, right, rather than just sort of dogmatically demonstrate it, that this definition is going to be put to work in some way. It's not just there describing something already there. Because, to be fair, this definition, by cause of itself, it doesn't point out anything. It doesn't point out God. It doesn't point out nature. It's not identified with anything else as of yet. So it's not saying, I'm dogmatically asserting causa sui. It's merely saying, if there is a thing called causa sui, this is what I mean by it. And I'm going to put that to work and show it to you through the working of the propositions and definitions. Now, going back to the actual definition, cause of itself. What the fuck? Like, what is it? What do you mean by cause of itself? What do you mean? What would it mean to say a cause of itself? Isn't that circular? Yes and no. I think this is a controversial definition, obviously. But let's think of a thought experiment. Let's say we're an atheist or an agnostic. We don't believe in God, so we can't appeal to theological arguments to explain why the universe is the way it is. But in fact, this problem also applies in the case of theologians, and in the case of theologians, and we'll see why. Let's say we wanted to give an account of why things are the way they are, the universe, everything. We might ask this atheist, or ourselves as the atheist or agnostic, why are things the way they are? How did we get here? Why? Why this? Not something other, right? Why is there something rather than nothing? And we might find two answers to that question. Maybe there's more, but these are the two that I think of right now. One, well, we don't know, and we will never know. There's not really a reasoned account that we can give of why this is the way that this is. Things are the way they are, and that's just it. You have to accept it. The universe exists, all of nature and its physical laws, etc. There's not really a rational ground for why they are the way they are. They just are. That seems pretty unsatisfying, though. But let's say we say, well, there was a cause. There was another cause before the universe came to be that caused the universe. But then the question becomes, what caused that other thing? And why that thing, right? How did we get here from that other thing? So we lead it into an infinite regress. And that's also unsatisfying. So what I want to propose is that Spinoza is trying to deal with this problem. And that causa sui is the necessary premise or necessary definition to begin a kind of ontology, like Euclid's elements. So we think of Euclid's elements as these definitions and propositions that flow from those definitions. Those definitions are the most rudimentary building blocks for constructing the whole of the enterprise. And so in this case, this definition, causa sui, it allows for one to sort of understand a thing. Who is the cause of itself? Now, going to the other parts of the text, the other clauses that are essential to understand, that by cause of itself, I understand that whose essence involves existence, or that whose nature cannot be conceived except as existing. So a distinction, essence, existence. A classic example is in the case of a centaur. I can conceive of the essence, the essential components of what it means for a centaur to be what it is, without thinking in its existence. And in fact, I don't have any existing centaurs around me, at least to my knowledge. And so I only need the essence of a centaur to conceive it as existing, or to sort of conceive it as, I can't conceive it as existing because the centaur does not in itself entail its existence. But I can conceive it, right? As kind of inhering in my mind, as it were. The classic exemplar of this kind of idea or thought experiment is Leibniz, who thinks that God, in their infinite capacity, infinite intellect, has conceived of all possibles at all. So that in the case of Alexander the Great, before Alexander the Great did anything, God, in the mind of God, Alexander the Great sort of was inhered as a kind of essence. And God chose to sort of enact and bring about the existence of this essence, which is to say, Alexander the Great, the full-fleshed being, who is the instantiation of an essence. That is the sort of bringing about the existence of this essence. Except for in this case, it's different. It's not a centaur, because in the case of a centaur, I can think of it and without its existence. But this causa sui, at least for Spinoza, immediately in thinking it, it already exists. It is what it is. So cause of itself, there's causation in the sense of direction, right? So like A to B, antecedent and consequent. But in this case, we have an antecedent who is also its consequent. So it seems circular in a certain way. But as we were sort of making an argument earlier in the theological case, we're trying to give an account of the beginning, of why things are the way they are. And at least Spinoza wants to say, well, nature causes itself, brings about itself, has its own reason account in itself. That is to say, its essence already entails its existence. And so there's a kind of, if we think of causation always in materiality, at this level, at the level of thought, Spinoza is proposing, this causa sui, it causes itself in thought in a certain respect. For what it means to be this thing, it means to already exist. There's a kind of self-entailment, if you want to put it that way. Now, of course, we haven't decided what exactly, if there is anything like causa sui. We just have established thus far and only that if there is a causa sui, that it entails itself. That is, its essence already involves its existence, or that in its very conception, it necessarily exists. And what I want to propose, like later on we'll find out, is that that's nature. Nature is known through itself. We know nature through itself. We know nature through its physical laws. A scientist investigates nature, and it doesn't need to appeal to any other ground. This is just, as I understand it, a straightforward naturalist argument, and the most thorough one. And in fact, I would say it's the metaphysical assumption that most naturalists make and have to make in order to investigate nature, and to sort of the metaphysical status that undergirds their epistemology, right? I know nature through itself and not through some other thing. And that thing is the cause of itself. And I can give a reason of that thing by appealing to itself, the effects, which are to say its physical laws. Now that's a controversial argument, and we'll have to find out what, like, through the actual text itself. But I think that's what's at stake in this premise. It's the necessary building block or element to build an ontology. Not to revise some things or to go back of what we covered. We covered the fact that Spinoza was born in 1632, died in 1677. He's a political and ethical thinker, above and beyond also the fact that he's a metaphysical epistemologist, he's a metaphysician, epistemologist, has a philosophy of mind, etc. And he has some interesting texts before he wrote the Ethics of Relevance, which is his the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, which shows his commitment to thinking about the highest good. Sorry, there's a little friendly creature that's joining us, a little spider. But anyways, anyways, I'll leave it at that. I'll see you, friends. See you another time. Have a good one.